Whispers in the dark. The pale moonlight seeped through the iron bars of my cell, casting eerie shadows on the cold stone walls. I sat on the hard, uncomfortable bed, my trembling hands clutching a pen as I prepared to write my final confession. Tomorrow was the day of my execution, and as I faced my last night on earth, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret. How had I come to this? It all began with a black cat named Pluto. My name is William Ashbury. Once, I led an ordinary life with my beloved wife, Eleanor, in a quaint house on the outskirts of the city. We shared a passion for animals, and our home was a haven for various pets. From my earliest years, I had been noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. Among the menagerie of creatures that graced our home, one stood out as my particular favorite, a large, intelligent black cat named Pluto. His coat was as dark as the night sky, sleek and shining, and his eyes held a wisdom that seemed almost human. Pluto and I shared a bond deeper than I had ever known with an animal before. He followed me everywhere, and I lavished him with attention and affection. For years, this idyllic existence continued. Eleanor and I were happy. Our home was filled with the joyful sounds of our animal companions, and Pluto reigned as the undisputed king of our little kingdom. But as the old adage goes, all good things must come to an end, and for me, that end began with a bottle. I had never been much of a drinker before, but stress at work and the gradual accumulation of life's little disappointments led me to seek solace in alcohol. At first, it was just a glass of wine with dinner, then a nightcap before bed. But soon, I found myself stopping at the local tavern on my way home, downing ale after ale until the world blurred around me. It was on one such night, stumbling home in a drunken stupor, that everything changed. As I fumbled with the key to our front door, I heard Pluto's familiar mew. He had always greeted me at the door, a ritual I had once found endearing. But in my inebriated state, his presence irritated me. I managed to open the door, nearly falling as I stepped inside. Pluto, as was his custom, wound himself between my legs, purring loudly. In my drunken clumsiness, I nearly tripped over him, and a surge of irrational anger swept through me. "Damn cat!" I roared, my voice slurred and hostile. I reached down, intending to shoo him away, but my movements were uncoordinated and rough. Pluto, sensing my unusual aggression, tried to dart away, but I managed to grab him. His startled yowl only fueled my anger. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small penknife. What happened next haunts me to this day. In a moment of drunken madness, I held Pluto down, and with the knife gouged out one of his eyes. The cat's agonized scream filled the house, a sound of pure pain and betrayal that sobered me instantly. Horror washed over me as I realized what I had done, but it was too late. Blood matted Pluto's fur, and his ruined eye socket was a grotesque testament to my cruelty. Eleanor, awakened by the commotion, came rushing downstairs. Her face paled at the sight before her of me, still holding the bloody knife, and Pluto, writhing in pain on the floor. "William," she gasped, her voice a mix of shock and disgust. "What have you done?" I had no answer for her. Shame and remorse flooded through me, but they were impotent in the face of the irreversible act I had committed. Eleanor tended to Pluto, carefully cleaning his wound and comforting him, while I retreated to our bedroom, unable to face the consequences of my actions. The next morning, I awoke with a pounding headache and a heart heavy with guilt. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and I felt physically ill. I made my way downstairs, dreading what I would find. Pluto was huddled in a corner, his remaining eye regarding me with a mixture of fear and accusation. The sight of his maimed face sent a fresh wave of remorse through me. I approached him slowly, murmuring apologies, but he hissed and backed away. The trust between us, built over years, had been shattered in a single moment of drunken violence. In the days that followed, I tried to make amends. I lavished Pluto with treats and gentle words, but he remained wary of me. His fear and avoidance only served to increase my guilt, which in turn fed a growing sense of irritation and resentment. To my shame, instead of confronting these feelings and seeking help, I turned again to the bottle. My drinking increased, and with it my temper grew shorter. I began to snap at Eleanor over trivial matters, and our once happy home became tense and uncomfortable. Pluto's constant presence, a reminder of my heinous act, began to grate on me. His one-eyed gaze seemed to follow me accusingly around the house. In my more sober moments, I recognized these thoughts as irrational. But alcohol and guilt had begun to warp my mind. Weeks passed, and my behavior grew increasingly erratic. Eleanor walked on eggshells around me, her once loving gaze now filled with fear and concern. She tried to talk to me about my drinking, but I brushed off her worries with angry retorts. Our friends began to visit less frequently, put off by the oppressive atmosphere that had descended upon our once cheerful home. Then came the day that sealed my fate. I had spent the afternoon at the tavern, drowning my sorrows in cheap whiskey. By the time I stumbled home, the world was a blur of anger and resentment. As I entered the house, I saw Pluto sitting on the stairs, his one eye gleaming in the dim light. Something in me snapped. All the guilt, shame, and self-loathing I had been carrying transmuted into a white-hot rage. I lunged for the cat, but he darted away, racing out into the backyard. Cursing, I followed, my alcohol-addled mind focused solely on catching the animal that had become the embodiment of my sins. In the yard stood an old apple tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. Pluto had scrambled up the trunk, and now perched on a low branch, watching me warily. The sight of him, just out of reach, infuriated me further. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I took the rope from the old tire swing that hung from the tree. My movements were methodical, almost dreamlike, as I fashioned a crude noose. Pluto, sensing the danger, tried to climb higher, but in his one-eyed state, his balance was off. I managed to grab him, ignoring his frantic struggles and the sharp pain, as his claws raked my arms. With a sense of detached calm that terrifies me to this day, I slipped the noose around his neck and hoisted him up, tying the other end of the rope to a sturdy branch. Pluto's death throes were mercifully short, but each second is seared into my memory. As his struggles ceased and his body went limp, the full weight of what I had done crashed over me. I fell to my knees, retching and sobbing, the enormity of my crime overwhelming me. I don't know how long I knelt there, under the swaying body of my once beloved pet. It was Eleanor's scream that finally roused me. She stood at the back door, her face a mask of horror, as she took in the scene before her. "Monster!" she cried, backing away from me. "What have you become?" I had no answer for her. What could I say? How could I explain the madness that had driven me to this act? I watched, numb and silent, as she ran back into the house, the sound of her sobs echoing in the still night air. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to face Eleanor. My dreams were plagued by visions of Pluto, his accusing eye following me through surreal landscapes. I woke repeatedly, drenched in sweat, the phantom sensation of fur beneath my hands. It was in the early hours of the morning that I smelled the smoke. At first, I thought it was just another part of my nightmares, but as consciousness fully returned, I realized the danger was all too real. Flames were already licking at the door of the guest room, the heat intense and suffocating. I shouted for Eleanor, praying she had already escaped. Covering my mouth with a damp cloth, I managed to make my way through the burning house and out onto the street. To my immense relief, I saw Eleanor standing there, wrapped in a blanket provided by one of our neighbors. We watched in stunned silence as our home, and everything in it, was consumed by the flames. By the time the fire brigade arrived, there was little left to save. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we stood amid the smoldering ruins of our life, everything reduced to ash and cinders. In the days that followed, as we sifted through the wreckage, a strange discovery was made. On one of the only walls left standing, there was an image seared into the plaster. It was the perfect outline of a cat hung from a rope. The sight chilled me to my core, for it was positioned exactly where Pluto's body would have been had the wall between the yard and the house not existed. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, a trick of the fire and smoke, but deep down I knew better. It was a sign, a message from beyond the grave. Pluto's spirit, it seemed, was not at rest. We moved into a small apartment in the city, all of our possessions fitting into a few suitcases. Eleanor was distant, speaking to me only when necessary. I knew our marriage was hanging by a thread, but I was at a loss as to how to repair the damage I had done. Guilt and remorse were my constant companions. I found myself unable to look at any cat without experiencing a mix of longing and terror. And yet, perversely, I felt drawn to them. It was as if some part of me sought punishment, wanted to be reminded of my terrible deed. It was this twisted desire that led me to the tavern that fateful night. I had managed to stay sober since the fire, but the weight of my guilt had driven me back to my old haunt. As I nursed my drink, movement in the corner of the bar caught my eye. There, perched on a stool, was a large black cat. My heart nearly stopped as I took in its appearance. It was the spitting image of Pluto, from its sleek, black fur to its intelligent yellow eyes. The only difference was a large white patch on its chest. Without thinking, I approached the animal. The bartender, seeing my interest, explained that the cat had been hanging around for a few days, and he was considering adopting it if no owner came forward. In a voice that sounded strange, even to my own ears, I offered to take the cat home. I don't know what possessed me to make such an offer. Perhaps it was a misguided attempt at redemption, or maybe some darker impulse that I didn't fully understand. Whatever the reason, I soon found myself walking home with the cat, cradled in my arms. Eleanor was surprised when I entered with our new pet, but she didn't object. I think she saw it as a sign that I was trying to change, to make amends for my past cruelty. For a while, things seemed to improve. The cat, which we never named, settled into our home, and its presence seemed to ease some of the tension between Eleanor and me. But as the days passed, I found myself growing uneasy around our new companion. Its resemblance to Pluto was uncanny, and I often caught myself staring at it, half expecting to see an empty eye socket. The white patch on its chest, which I had initially found distinctive, began to take on a sinister aspect in my mind. To my increasingly disturbed imagination, it looked like a gallows. I began to avoid the cat, but it seemed to seek me out. No matter where I went in our small apartment, I would turn to find it watching me with its unblinking yellow eyes. Sleep became difficult as I was convinced I could hear it, scratching at the bedroom door, even when Eleanor assured me it was sleeping peacefully in the living room. My behavior grew erratic once more. I snapped at Eleanor over trivial matters and jumped at small noises. More than once, she suggested I seek help, but I dismissed her concerns. How could I explain to anyone the irrational fear and guilt that consumed me? The breaking point came on a sweltering summer afternoon. Eleanor and I were descending the steep stairs to the basement of our apartment building, where our storage unit was located. The cat, as was its habit, was following close behind. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the cat darted between my feet. I lost my balance, nearly falling headlong onto the concrete floor. In that moment, all the fear, guilt, and anger that had been building inside me exploded. I turned, my hand raised to strike the animal. Eleanor, seeing the madness in my eyes, moved to stop me. "William, no!" she cried, grabbing my arm. What happened next occurred so quickly, it seemed almost unreal. My arm, already in motion, connected not with the cat but with Eleanor. She stumbled backward, losing her footing on the narrow stairs. I watched in horror as she fell, her head striking the edge of a step with a sickening crack. The basement fell silent. The cat had vanished, and Eleanor lay motionless at the foot of the stairs. Blood began to pool around her head, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that she was gone. Panic seized me. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't call for help. Who would believe this was an accident? I was a known drunk with a history of violence towards animals. No, I had to hide what I had done. With shaking hands, I lifted Eleanor's body. Our storage unit contained some old construction materials, left over from the previous tenant. I cleared a space in the rear wall, just large enough to conceal a body. It was gruesome work, but fear and adrenaline drove me on. Once the grotesque task was complete, I carefully replaced the bricks, making sure the new work blended seamlessly with the old. I spread mortar with care, my hands steady despite the horror of what I was doing. When I was finished, no one would be able to tell the wall had been disturbed. I cleaned the blood from the floor and stairs, disposing of the soiled rags in a dumpster several blocks away. Then I returned to our apartment and waited, my mind numb with shock and disbelief. Days passed, and no one seemed to notice Eleanor's absence. We had few friends in the city, and her job as a freelance writer meant she often went days without contacting anyone. I fabricated a story about her visiting a sick aunt in case anyone asked. All the while, I was tormented by guilt and fear. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment the police would break down the door. The cat had disappeared the day of Eleanor's death, and for that, at least, I was grateful. On the fourth day after Eleanor's death, there was a knock at the door. My heart nearly stopped as I opened it to find two police officers standing there. They explained that one of our neighbors had reported hearing a disturbance, and they were following up. I invited them in, forcing myself to remain calm. I explained that my wife was out of town, and perhaps the neighbor had heard me moving furniture. The officers seemed satisfied, but as they turned to leave, one of them mentioned the basement storage units. "We'd like to take a look down there if you don't mind," he said. Just to be thorough. My mouth went dry, but I knew refusing would only arouse suspicion. With a nonchalance I didn't feel, I led them down to the basement. As we descended the stairs, I found myself babbling nervously about the building's history, the sturdiness of its construction. We reached the storage unit, and I unlocked it with trembling hands. The officers looked around, their flashlights sweeping the cluttered space. I held my breath as the beams of light passed over the newly bricked wall. Copier Triclaude's response was limited as it hit the maximum length, aloud at this time. "Anios au taxon." Edith continuing the story. But they showed no interest in it. As we prepared to leave, a sudden, inexplicable urge came over me. Perhaps it was the strain of maintaining my facade, or maybe some deep-seated desire for punishment. But I found myself tapping on the new brickwork with my cane. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears, "you see how well this house is built. These walls, they're solid as a rock. I don't know what made me do it. Perhaps it was a moment of madness, or the weight of my guilt finally breaking through. Whatever the reason, I raised my cane and struck the wall hard, right where I knew Eleanor's body lay hidden. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from within the wall came a sound that turned my blood to ice. It was a cry, low and muffled at first, but quickly rising to a shrill, inhuman scream. The officers stared at the wall in shock, then at me. I stood frozen, my cane still raised, as the horrible sound continued. With surprising speed, the officers sprang into action. They pushed me aside and began tearing at the bricks with their bare hands. I made no move to stop them, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a perverse sense of relief. As the wall came down, the sight that greeted us was like something from a nightmare. There was Eleanor's body, already showing signs of decay, her face frozen in an expression of fear and betrayal. But that wasn't what had made the sound. Sitting atop her corpse, its yellow eyes gleaming in the dim light, was the black cat. The animal let out another unearthly yowl, leaping from its gruesome perch and darting between the legs of the shocked officers. In the chaos that followed, I simply sank to my knees, laughing and sobbing hysterically as the officers handcuffed me. The trial was a blur. I confessed to everything: Pluto's murder, the fire, Eleanor's death. The prosecutors painted a picture of a deranged alcoholic, a man who had descended into madness and murder. My lawyer tried to argue for insanity, but I knew I deserved whatever punishment awaited me. And so, here I sit in my cell on death row, writing these words as my last confession. Tomorrow, I will face the gallows, a fitting end, given the obsession with hanging that has haunted me since Pluto's death. But even now, as I near my end, I am tormented. In the darkest corners of my cell, I sometimes catch a glimpse of gleaming yellow eyes. I hear the soft pad of paws on the cold stone floor, the quiet rustle of fur against the bars. Is it the black cat somehow still following me, intent on seeing its revenge through to the bitter end? Or is it simply the product of my guilty conscience, conjuring phantoms to torment me in my final hours? I'll never know for certain. But as I pen these final words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. There's a soft sound from the shadows, like the purr of a contented cat. And as the first light of dawn breaks through my window, heralding my last day on earth, I swear, I can feel the gentle pressure of a feline body rubbing against my legs. Perhaps in the end, this is my true punishment. Not the hangman's noose that awaits me, but the knowledge that even in death, I will find no peace. The black cat, be it Pluto his successor, or merely a figment of my tortured psyche, will follow me into eternity, a constant reminder of my crimes. As I set down my pen for the last time, I can only hope that my story serves as a warning to others. Beware the power of guilt, the dangers of addiction, and above all, the mysterious bond between humans and animals. For in that bond lies the potential for both great love and terrible destruction. The guards are coming now. I can hear their footsteps echoing down the corridor. It's time to face my fate. But even as they lead me away, I can't help but glance back at my cell. And there, in the deepest shadow, I see them one last time, two gleaming yellow eyes, watching me go